That good old Breath of the Wild fever is still as strong as ever. Recently, I asked all of you to tell me one thing you think should be included in the upcoming sequel. Y'all snapped back real quick with answers ranging from online multiplayer to the return of classic Zelda music. In response to your feedback on that post, I've crafted a list of 5 things Breath of the Wild 2 absolutely needs. Let's begin. Having the ability to traverse the depths of Hyrule's waters was sorely missed in Breath of the Wild. You can get the complete Zora armor, yet you can't dive but an inch below the surface. Then we have the massive bodies of water on the south and eastern portions of the map that you can explore. And sadly, even Lake Hylia, which is notorious for its underwater segments, is all but left abandoned and unused. While not always implemented in the best ways, underwater exploration has been a staple of 3D Zelda titles. It could be argued that the Zelda team has been trying to move away from past traditions, but I believe this is one that they could refine and do a lot more with in the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Just like the climbing mechanic opened up all kinds of new and interesting pathways in Breath, in its sequel, diving beneath the surface of the water could have the same effect. Imagine diving off the coast of Tingle Island and uncovering sunken treasure, or being able to fully take in the beauty of the coral reefs near Lurelin Village. Or even better, returning to Lake Hylia to take on the dreaded water temple one last time. Seeing as we might just be embarking on a whole new adventure in Hyrule, adding the capability to tap into an entirely new subsection of the map would give those aforementioned locations the love they deserve. They could even implement this into exploring caves if that's the route the Zelda team decides to take. I can't express enough how it would need to be implemented correctly though. Definitely not like Ocarina of Time, but more like its sequel, Majora's Mask. Giving a Hylian the full abilities of a Zora while underwater is almost a must at this point. Going back to the clunky days of using the Zora tunic and the iron boots is far too outdated. A swimming mechanic similar to what's seen in a game known as Abzu would work exceptionally well for Breath of the Wild 2. Another aspect to consider here is combat. In the original game, once you're in the water, you're basically a sitting duck unless you have the Zora helm. An easy way to alleviate this would be to allow the player to use projectile weapons like bows, spears, and harpoons while swimming, opening up a range of combat maneuvers while submerged. For boss fights, I'd like to see something similar to the battle against Hydrus in a game known as Shadow of the Colossus. There's something ever so terrifying about a massive creature ready to pop out at you at any second to drag you down to the depths of an open body of water. I know this is going to be a toss-up for most, but for myself and many others, including an underwater section in Breath of the Wild sequel is a must. Something else the sequel desperately needs is a good set of main bosses. In the original, Ganon had been used and abused so much, he'd morphed into an unrecognizable, bland, boring goo that you have to fight not only once, but 5 freaking times. What happened to bosses like Agorok, Bongo Bongo, and our demon lord Girahim? Maz Koshio was sweet, but we need more variety than one original boss in the next game. With Ganondorf rising from the dead, I'm sure we can expect to be finding a few wicked amalgamations of past Zelda bosses with new and exciting twists added to each. In fact, I hope they turn out similar to what we saw with the mini-bosses scattered throughout Hyrule in Breath of the Wild. The Lynels, Hinox, and Taluses were all rather enjoyable to go around fighting over and over. And let me tell ya, that feeling of staring down a silver-maned Lynel for the first time, it's worse than fighting Calamity Ganon buck naked if you ask me. Do you recall me mentioning Shadow of the Colossus earlier? That right there is a great example of the type of bosses I'm talking about. Utilizing Link's climbing skill would allow for some massive bouts, the likes of which have never been seen in any Zelda game. To this day, I still don't know why they didn't do this with the Dark Beast Ganon fight. Kaiju aside, a main boss similar to Iron Knuckle from Ocarina of Time or the Dark Nut from Twilight Princess would be interesting as well. Taking the battle to a skilled hand is a lot more intimidating than some goofy looking clump of malice with guardian parts duct taped to it. Come to think of it, another magic wielding boss would be nice to see too. Using high-ranking members of the Yiga clan or a malice-infused wizrobe could easily work. Anything is better than the blights. I could keep going, but you get my point. We need better bosses in Breath of the Wild 2. For number 3, I had to mash up 2 in 1. Playable Zelda and co-op. Two things that have been talked about even before we called Breath of the Wild Zelda Wii U. For the longest, fans of the series have been clamoring to play as Princess Zelda in an officially released 3D title. As a matter of fact, people wanted to play as her so bad in Breath of the Wild, a group of modders banded together to release an impressively detailed, playable Zelda mod, with nearly more customization options than even Link himself. If you want to check out the Zelda mod, I've left a link in the card up top and in the description below. I highly recommend taking a gander at the group's hard work. Regardless, the mod gave us a taste of what we've all been asking for. So please, Nintendo, for the love of Hylia, make Zelda playable in the sequel. They could do this in a few different ways. Either have Zelda as a character you can select from the main menu, or one of the more likely options, have a designated section where you switch between Link and Zelda, similar to the system used in Marvel's Spider-Man on PS4. The way the game switches between Mary Jane and Peter during certain parts of the game worked rather well. Of course, the Zelda team would put their own little spin on it. They might try having Zelda around all the time too. Being able to switch between two characters at a moment's notice could set up for some interesting combat scenarios. It'd be even better if the Zelda team took inspiration from God of War. Not so much the blood and gore part, but the way Atreus worked. This would allow for the player to still be Link, somewhat control Zelda, and not have the mechanic be too overbearing for those that don't actually want to play as her. In a perfect world, this would somehow integrate co-op or multiplayer into the equation as well. If Zelda's going to be around all the time, why not make her playable for co-op? The Zelda team has been playing around with this idea for years with 2D titles. Now it's time to finally bring it to full realization in 3D. If not in the main game, maybe they could add another bonus map that you can use solely for playing co-op or multiplayer akin to GTA 5. Playing in a sandbox like Hyrule in multiplayer would be a blast. Too bad that supposed multiplayer mod for Breath of the Wild turned out to just be concept art. Maybe, just maybe, if we're lucky, we'll see both of these things worked into the sequel in some way. Better dungeons is a given at this point, right? Don't get me wrong, the divine beasts were neat, but let's be real here. Our enemy-filled, uniquely themed dungeons need to make a return in a big way. We want dungeons like the Spirit Temple in Ocarina, the Ancient Cistern from Skyward, or Snow Peak from Twilight. Each of these has their own motif that make them stand out from one another. The puzzles are interesting, and they're broken up with enemies as to not make them feel completely barren. Translating that into Breath of the Wild 2 is obviously easier said than done. But if we can get mods like this Earth Temple mod shown here, then I have faith we'll be seeing some rather interesting dungeon design this time around. Not to get too ahead of myself, but the E3 trailer has me thinking we'll be getting exactly what we've all been asking for. The dark theme of Hyrule's cave system reminds me of how insanely epic it felt to enter a temple for the first time in Skyward Sword. Those pre-entrance cutscenes built up anticipation so well. Seeing as we might have some of the entrances pop up out of the ground just like the shrines did in the original game, we could get that same type of moment, taking a step into the dark unknown of Hyrule's underground. I feel as though the puzzle department will do just fine. The puzzles found in the shrines and divine beasts in Breath of the Wild were polished and thoroughly entertaining, other than the ones that use motion controls, of course. However, in the sequel, we need to see loads more traps and enemies to throw us veteran players off our game. Including a mini-boss and a variety of low-level enemies in a certain area of a dungeon can fix the pacing problem seen in Divine Beasts. A dungeon more to the tune of what's seen in what I like to call Breath of the Wild's one and only true dungeon, Hyrule Castle. It has the theme, enemies, traps, and puzzles that I'm talking about. It doesn't force you through it, but if you take your time, you can learn to appreciate the traditional dungeon design the castle has to it. This is the treatment the sequel's dungeons need. Before we jump into number 5, here are a few honorable mentions. Fishing, petting doggos, unique items like the hookshot, and old school Zelda music. Including a weapon repair and upgrade system is something I think we can all agree is needed in Breath's sequel. The weapon system in the original was fun, but let's leave that in the past and continue improving. The next step would be to add a repair and modification mechanic of sorts. We've all seen this implemented in other games, but I'm very fond of how the repair system works in Fallout 3. All you have to do is have the same type of weapon and bam, you can repair it on the fly. It was later scrapped, but I always loved how easy it was to repair your higher tiered weapons on the go, instead of having to travel all the way to a bench just to find out you didn't have the parts necessary. Upgrades could work in the same way. Say you find a standard boomerang. With a system like this, you could essentially take any other boomerang and combine them to upgrade its stats. A system that uses materials similar to cooking has some potential to it as well. Same scenario. You find a standard boomerang, but you want it to have some type of elemental effect. Take a weapon, add a touch of topaz, and finish it off with an electric key swing to seal in the energy, and you got yourself an electric boomerang. Adding either of these would leave the doors open for a number of special weapon variants, making the combat system pop that much more. Those were just a few ideas. But seeing as everyone was so annoyed with the fact that weapons break so often in the original, Breath of the Wild 2 for sure has to make some upgrades in that department. And that's a wrap. What did you think? I'm sure you have your own list of things you feel need to make it into this exciting new adventure, so why don't you leave them down in the comments below and I'll read them later. Do you want to get in on the action when it comes to these kinds of videos? Make sure to take a peek at my community section from time to time. That's where I post all kinds of updates when it comes to new content, polls, and more. Now, if you're as hyped for Breath of the Wild 2 as I am, hit that like button, share this video with a friend, and if you happen to be new to the channel, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay up to date when I post a new video. As always, thank you all so much for watching, have a wonderful rest of your week. Peace out.